beneath all anger is fear, and beneath all fear is love. And what I understand that to mean is, like, people express anger because they're afraid of something, and what they're usually afraid of is that something they love is going to be taken away from them.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Do you remember your first movie-going experience? Well, I do, because it scared me. Men in hazmat suits walking down tunnels to get to an ashen gray extraterrestrial who was just trying to make his way back home had me running up the aisle to escape the theater. But I couldn't just leave. I had to stay and watch. So I opened the door. I looked through the window. I wanted to know if my new friend found his way home. You know, this experience started my deep love of moving pictures and my recognition of the power of story. How could I, as a little boy, empathize with an alien that loved Reese's Pieces? It's the power of telling a better story. And this is what Gareth Higgins does in this episode. Gareth's voice is one that I resonate with deeply. He is a compassionate storyteller. He's a deep thinker and someone that subverts our way of seeing the world. This conversation is an exploration of how storytelling, empathy, and a commitment to love can transform even the most entrenched conflicts. Gareth shares his personal journey, growing up in Northern Ireland, where the dominant narrative was one of division, fear, and violence. But through the transformative power of films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Gareth discovered the importance of seeing the humanity in those we might otherwise label as other. He realized the need to become an ally, not by imposing his own vision, but by listening and allowing those he seeks to support to define what true allyship looks like. And Gareth goes on to unpack a profound insight that all conflict is rooted in fear, and beneath that fear lies love. And by learning to love and accept ourselves, we open the door to a new kind of storytelling, one that moves beyond us versus them narratives and towards a vision of liberation, reconciliation, and interdependence. This conversation is a masterclass in the power of imagination, empathy, and a willingness to embrace the complexity of the human experience. Whether you're navigating personal struggles or seeking to understand the roots of societal conflict, Gareth's wisdom offers a roadmap towards a more just, compassionate, and connected world. So join us. Here is my conversation with Gareth Higgins. Gareth, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really, really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
You know, it seems like a lot of your work as you're doing peacemaking, that you're writing about movies, spirituality, and how it intersects with our lives. A lot of it seems to be about story and storytelling, telling a different story or a better story of the one that we're living now. What kind of stories were you telling yourself and the culture around you was telling yourself when you were growing up?
Wow. Well, I grew up in the north of Ireland, and the story that dominated the culture was the story of conflict, us versus them, sorrow, suffering, fear, literal violence. I'm right, you're wrong. Or they're wrong, we're right. Sometimes depends on which goes first, you know. But then also, we're brilliant. This is the best place in the world. There's nobody like us. Keep your head down. Don't get involved. A curse on both their houses. Although actually, you know, my family, that's a much more bleak way of putting it. My family, which has a very mixed ethnic and religious and political heritage, were very, very strong on not blaming one side or the other for the horrendous mess we were in. And part of that was because my parents had been bereaved through violence, and the violence had come from different parts of the wider community. You know, there's a narrative in the north of Ireland that says we have two communities, the Protestant British community and the Catholic Irish community. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that we have one divided community. Another way of looking at it is that there's many, many communities. And my parents had experienced horrendous bereavement through violence that had come from all over the place, let's put it that way. In a sense, you know, that could turn you into someone who blames everybody, or it could also contribute to you becoming someone who sees that violence is the enemy, not a particular group of people, that absolutism is the enemy. An enemy might actually be the enemy. The concept of enemy in the sense of like we have someone who must be eradicated, must be stopped. And certainly there are behaviors that need to be held accountable and prevented, but my parents never identified or defined any one group of people as bad or good. So those were some of the stories. And I guess at an individual level, I had a personal story of I'm different. I'm an outsider. I wasn't particularly bullied. I was at least one or two steps above the people who were most bullied, you know, and I had empathy for them, but I also didn't stand up for them enough. I was just sort of like not popular and had a few friends, but spent a lot of time in my own mind. And part of that was because I have the great virtue of not being interested in sport, and and deep empathy for those who are. You know, I do like going to baseball games, but mostly because of the community experience there. I was never interested in sports, and when you're growing up as I was in the late 70s and the 80s and early 90s in the north of Ireland, there wasn't a whole lot to do if you weren't into rugby, if you were a boy, as I was. And so what happened to me was I got into movies because my mum and my dad introduced me to good movies when I was quite young. And that, you know, the experience of watching other people's projected dreams on a screen can really affect, especially if you're not fully self-conscious or aware yet, as most of us are as children. You like, there's this innocent frame that can be projected onto. You end up kind of creating a life of the mind that can be very rich, very imaginative, quite confusing at times. And in my case, as I was growing up as someone not really understanding that I wasn't straight, whatever straight was, you know, I didn't have that language. I just knew in my mind, I believed there's something wrong with me because I was, you know, someone who would identify as a bisexual person or now as a queer person. I just didn't have that language. The only language I had was sin or sick or even demon possessed. So all that contributes to you having the potential for a rich imaginative life, but also not knowing where you are because the dominant story is saying you either have to be this thing or that thing. You either have to be on this side of a political conflict or that side of a political conflict, and you need to be this kind of person to fit in your religious community. And my religious community meant a whole lot to me. So I suppose another part of the story was that Jesus is coming soon, and it's not going to be pretty. But then also, I was among religious people who felt Jesus is calling us to peacemaking. So those are a lot of stories, and I hope that the rest of this podcast episode is good therapy for me.
That's good. Well, I want to go back into maybe your earliest memory of a movie that's opened up your imagination, that the story that you were living didn't have to be the story of your life.
Gosh. Well, let me answer a different question as a way of answering the question you are asking. I went to see The Goonies on my 11th birthday party, and you know, that's for anyone in the audience who unfathomably hasn't seen The Goonies. It's a film from 1985, directed by Richard Donner, written by Christopher Columbus, based on a story by Steven Spielberg about a gang of kind of misfit kids who find a treasure map and go looking for the treasure while being pursued by a criminal family, you know, and it's an adventure story. And 11 years old was exactly the right time to see it because I was just slightly younger than the age of the youngest kids in the film, and so I aspired to be them. And I remember coming home from that film, and the handful of friends who'd been there with me, they were in my bedroom playing darts with my dad, because I had a dartboard in my bedroom and Dad was playing darts. So then I went into the bathroom and wept, literally wept, because I was realizing my sense of isolation and loneliness. And honestly, this is going to sound pathetic, but it drove me to something really healing. The feeling was, I will never have a life like the Goonies. I will never have an adventure like the Goonies. I will never be part of a community like the Goonies. And I have a very, very strong memory of that happening 38 years ago. So that was like, that pushed me to think, I don't like my story. I don't like being isolated. I yearn for connection. I yearn for community. I yearn for purpose. But the story that sort of responds more directly to your question is, when I was 13, the BBC screened One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest for the first time. And this was strange because like back in the late 80s, early 90s, it sometimes took a long time before a movie would show up on TV, and it actually took 13 years before that movie showed up on TV after being in the theaters. And my parents had gone to see it when they were 25 years old, and I had just been born. It was screening on TV, and they said, you need to stay up and watch this, right? That's cool. Parents are usually saying you need to go to bed and not watch this. And I remember like it started at 10 o'clock at night, and it was in late December. And I watched it with them, and I had never seen anything like this. I'd never seen the inside of what would have then been called a mental institution. I'd never seen people of such frailty and marginalization in a community together, living in this ward where some of them are there involuntarily, some of them are there because they checked themselves in. I'd never seen a story of oppression in the form of Nurse Ratched, who with authoritarianism just rules over these broken men's lives. And I'd never seen a story of kind of a revolutionary rebel in the form of the Jack Nicholson character, McMurphy, who calls forth a freedom spirit among these people. And I think most of all, there's a Native American character in that film, in that book, who they call the Chief. And I don't think I didn't watch Cowboys and Indians films as a kid, and I maybe even by that time in my life I was probably already tuning into, there's a lot of offensive stuff in those films and mistreatment of like the cultural representation of Native American people has mistreated Native American people just the way Native American people were mistreated physically. I don't mean that it's equal, of course. Genocide's worse than a bad movie, but the character of the Chief in that film and what he represents and the act of mercy that he carries out at a risk to his own life, and then how he frees himself and becomes a model of freedom for other people. Like, I'm talking to you from the perspective of being 49 years old and having a wee bit more articulacy about what that film was. At the time, I just felt it at a gut level. And I remember crying watching it. And I remember what I processed later was, this is a thing called empathy. This is looking at people who at one level are nothing like me at all, certainly not at 13 years old. I was not like any of the characters in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I wasn't in a mental institution. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't being mistreated. There wasn't an authoritarian figure like that in my life. But I was lonely, and I actually was a bit trapped, and I was a bit ruled over by stories that weren't mine. And I did need an ally like the Chief. And I did need to become my own ally. So, yeah, I would say 13 is when that happened, and it's been happening ever since.
So then, what does it look like for you then coming into that story of becoming an ally to others? That was part of that movie that you say, I need to say these people over here, they don't have a voice, or they're being mistreated, or their story is they're being subjugated, whatever the conflict is in their own lives, to be an ally to somebody. What made you push towards being an ally?
The starting point for a response to that question is there's a lot to be said for not calling yourself an ally and allowing the people you're trying to ally with to tell you whether or not you're doing a good job of being an ally. And I think we can, get into word policing and being puritanical about that. And so I prefer to use the word like I aspire to being an ally to people who I can support. And I also feel like my path into that it's sort of two things happened at once. One was realizing the problem in the north of Ireland, the sorrow, the suffering in the north of Ireland had something to do with powerful people mistreating people who had less power. And if you're a representative of the powerful people, you need to evaluate what role you're playing in that. Even if you're just a voter, or you're passively not voting or not contributing. Like if you're benefiting because of things that your forebears did, we should ask ourselves, is there something that should be done about this? Can there be something done about this? What should my relationship with my unequal neighbor be? The neighbor whose forebears were mistreated by my forebears. Have we fully ironed that out? Have we made amends for that? And at the same time, I don't know if there's anybody who's just one thing. And so realizing that I wasn't just Protestant British, that I'm effectively, one way of looking at me, I'm 50% Protestant British ethnically, and I'm 50% Catholic Irish, Indigenous Catholic Irish ethnically. So there was a sense of like, I can sort of see different dimensions of this. I can be in solidarity with people who I'm already kind of, my people are their people, and I can be self-critical of the other part of my people who are sort of blind to their own privilege. But then frankly, growing up in a homophobic society, or in like a profoundly homophobic society, and knowing from within that I needed support. Again, it didn't manifest with those words. I just felt there was something wrong with me, and that I had to change that. And I think that's actually a helpful way if you're trying to talk about allyship with people who are reluctant to believe that they may have played any negative role just by existing or by being born into a privileged lineage, put it that way. You could ask people, well, where do you find a sense of lack in your life? The median member of society doesn't intuitively understand what's going on for you. I can give an example that may be sensitive for some people, but I mean this, I really do mean this respectfully. I have one of my dearest friends is a man in his 70s. I've known him since he was in his late 50s. He's white, he's straight, he's cisgender. He would consider himself, he's relatively wealthy. He has significant hearing impairment, which you don't know unless you get to know him. And because he wears very almost invisible hearing aids. And he's also Jewish, and you don't know that unless you get to know him either. And so there's two places where I had to learn as an adult that having a hearing impairment, no matter how powerful, wealthy, strong, protected a person is, that puts someone at a disadvantage to me because I don't have a hearing impairment. And being Jewish in a society where anti-Semitism is still alive puts him in a situation that I'm not facing. You can help people see by asking them, where do you feel a lack that other people generally don't understand? And then ask yourself, where do you think other people might feel a lack that you don't understand? And are there things you can do? So an example, in my friend's case, I'm often in group settings where someone will be offered a microphone to speak with, and they'll say, I don't need it, and I've done that myself. But if I'm emceeing or chairing the meeting, I'll insist that they use it, because I might say, you may not need it, but it's not for you. That's like, there may well be someone in the room who really needs you to use this. And frankly, you could be embarrassing them if you put them on the spot and say, does anybody here need me to use this? And again, we don't want to word police, and we don't want to walk on eggshells or be on thin ice. I think this is actually about a beautiful journey of growing together and learning and giving each other space to pay attention to the needs of others can actually open up more possibility of getting our own needs met too. It's not rocket science, and it's not all a one-way street. This is about the family of humanity and increasing our sense of interdependence and our connection with not just other human beings, but with the ecosystem. And there have been some movies that have helped me with that. And there's a lot of movies that if those movies were to come and sit down with me and ask for a feedback session, I would be glad to give them feedback on how to do it better. But I've never yet been asked for feedback by a movie.
My name is Father David, and I'm a Franciscan friar, and every week, me and my guests dive into some of the most pressing issues of our time: church and state, immigration, LGBTQ+, economic inequality, anxiety, depression, climate change, and so much more. Join us in these conversations. Friar Time isn't just another podcast, it's where faith meets real life head on. You can find all the links to our podcast channels in your show notes.
Tell me if you agree with this or not. This assessment that I have, is all conflict rooted in fear?
Yeah.
If I say all conflict is rooted in fear, what do you say about that? And then how do we determine what we're afraid of? And then where do we go from there? Like, if peacemaking is an art of like identifying the fear and getting rid of that fear, how do we do that?
Okay, well, I'll backtrack and I'll say my response to your question is all conflict rooted in fear. The answer is yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe. Perfect.
And certainly enough of it that we should be devoting a lot of our attention to figuring out how to respond to fear. There's a Zen teaching that says that beneath all anger is fear, and beneath all anger is fear, and beneath all fear is love. And what I understand that to mean is, like, people express anger because they're afraid of something, and what they're usually afraid of is that something they love is going to be taken away from them. And so if you start with asking, okay, what is it you love that's manifesting in fear because you think it's going to be taken away from you, and then you're acting with anger or violence in order to either lash out or to express that fear that this thing you love is going to be taken away from you, or to prevent it being taken away. And sometimes the answer to the question of what do you love is you have a distorted love. Like, you love your tribe, but you don't love humanity. Or you love your money more than you love sharing. Or you love your land more than you love the planet. Or you love your reputation more than you love the feeling of doing the right thing, even if it causes some people to look down on you. And of course there are actually sometimes, like, you love your loved ones and you're afraid something's going to happen to them. That's legit, of course. But what you do about that is the question. So, there's pretty great thoroughgoing work in the area of conflict transformation, which I prefer that term to conflict resolution, because I'm not sure conflict has to get resolved. Even if it does get resolved, some things have to happen first. So if the conflict is violent, it needs to transform into a less violent conflict, and then a non-violent conflict. And then it can perhaps even be a collaborative conflict. And then it can become creative difference. And then maybe eventually it can become interdependent alignment, which is not the same thing as everybody being the same. It just means my bottom line is I won't do anything to consciously harm you, and you won't do anything to consciously harm me. Let's start there and then imagine what else is possible. The thing that's going on kind of in terms of ethno-political conflict in the US and elsewhere today is deeply understandable through that lens. People are angry because they're scared, and they're scared because they think something they love is going to be taken away from them. And so they opt for one of two binary choices when we're talking about presidential elections, for instance. And I mean, the US is a strange place because it's so often, at least discourse so often comes down to what these two people mean. I come from a society where there's at least 10 political parties that have a national profile, and there's only 1.9 million people in the north of Ireland. And so we always had much more of a choice, and we have a proportional representation voting system, which is a form of rank order voting system where you don't just vote for one candidate, you choose candidates in order of your preference. And so it's not a binary choice. And that means that the political parties have to make themselves at least palatable, if not attractive, to more than their base in order to get elected. And they can't go around humiliating their political opponents. They can't, because they've come to understand that, I mean, this is something I just find so strange, that when politicians speak ill of their political opponents and not realize all their followers are going to feel like you're trying to humiliate them, and you've just lost any possibility of any of their base changing their mind. Yeah, those would be the things I say. And it takes a lot of work, takes a lot of practice, but it isn't rocket science. The starting point is to ask yourself, what am I afraid of? The next thing is to ask, who do I know that's wise enough to help me with this? The next thing is, so that wise person may be dead and have written a book that you can read, or they might be Gandhi, or they might be your grandmother, or they might be someone you've no hope of ever meeting, but they have a good podcast. And seek out mentors, the fruit of whose lives is a more collaborative, less violent society in which more people thrive, and ask what they did to get there, and see what you can adopt in your own life. You got to make sure you're comparing the right scale. So, like, it's not fully useful for me to compare myself with what presidents do, because I don't have the position of a president. But there are principles certainly that you can think about and adopt within your own life. And I do think it comes back to, what would it be like to make a commitment to, first of all, do no conscious harm, starting with not harming yourself, which would lead you to be tender enough to look at your fears and not shame yourself for having those fears in the first place. But ask, am I manifesting those? First of all, are those fears accurate? Are they proportionate to what's real? And what would be the healthiest way for me to allow those fears to breathe? Because it's almost certainly not by dehumanizing somebody else or by attacking somebody else.
You know, one of the things that we talk about, Jesus said to love others as you love yourself. And we don't often actually think about, how do we analyze what we're afraid of to be able to love ourselves well enough to be able to love others. It feels like if I let my fear control me, I'm not going to be able to love other people well. What does it look like to investigate that inside of our own soul?
Yeah, there's this really interesting thing for me, is that, like, the wisest things that humans have apprehended and articulated are usually completely disregarded, or they've had their power taken out of them by becoming slogans on a greeting card. Like the word love, which has all these connotations of soft, gentle, sentiment, and it can be those things. But it's also what leads people to go and clear landmines so that other people won't be blown to bits when they go out for a walk in a field in Myanmar. And it's also what drove a friend of mine at 29 years old, Presbyterian minister, when she was invited to have secret dialogue that helped contribute to the foundation for the peace process, talking with people she wasn't sure she was safe with, but deciding to do it because it was better to do it than not to do it. It might achieve some positive change. It might help other people. That's love. Or as my late beautiful friend and mentor, Mike Riddell, once defined love as the willingness. People always kind of laugh when I say this, but the laughter is kind of it's an awkward laugh of discomfort, like the concept. And that's fine. People can laugh and then think about it afterwards. Love is the willingness to bathe the hemorrhoids of a person who's not able to reach, right? There may come a time in your life, in my life, where we need someone to bathe us because we can't do it anymore. And these things are not weak. They are gentle, or they can connect with gentleness, but they're not weak. They're actually creative and courageous. So to love yourself is actually a countercultural act of, it can be an act of courage, certainly an act of creativity. And the reason it's countercultural is we don't yet live in a society where loving yourself has been fully articulated as a virtue. It gets paid lip service to, and then there's the whole self-help world, which another late dear friend and mentor of mine, John O'Donoghue, used to say that the self-help and the spirituality literature section of a bookstore, 95% of what's in there has the philosophical consistency of melted ice cream. Right? A lot of it's not great, but there is some real substance there, and anything that is consciously intending to try to move us toward more love of self, not in an egocentric way, but in a way that actually helps expand our sense of self to include the whole of humanity and maybe even the whole of the ecosystem. This is actually what's going to save the human race. And I mean, the planet probably doesn't need saving, because the planet will take care of itself whether humans are here or not. Although if humans aren't here, there'll be no one here to enjoy it. So I think it'd be really good if we saved both humanity and the planet. And if we took ourselves seriously enough, we'd love ourselves more. But you have to develop habits of mind and practices to open that up to you if you weren't constitutionally made as a person who just loves yourself. And very, very few people are. There are a lot of people who worship themselves because of a broken ego. Most of us have a deflated ego. I think I have a combination deflated and inflated ego, depending on the day or the issue. But I am a work in progress. And the first practice toward loving yourself that I recommend to a lot of people is to stand in front of a mirror, look at the person in the mirror, and ask yourself, how would I treat this person if they were my best friend? Because we're often treating ourselves worse than we treat our best friends. We're less tolerant with ourselves. We don't enjoy our own presence. And it takes time. It takes time. And the last thing you want is to start feeling guilty for not loving yourself enough gives you another reason to not love yourself. So it's okay to be gentle with yourself. It's okay to be a work in progress.
Are you looking for peace and joy? Do you want to refresh your life and raise your well-being? You need Create Harmony. At Create Harmony, we focus on everyday joys and we savor life's blessings. Our episodes are filled with creativity and fun, and we believe in setting an intentional rhythm. Listen in to Create Harmony to learn how to use your imagination as a way of listening to God, and remind yourself how to notice goodness all around you.
Yes. We need a new imagination for not only just loving ourselves, but moving towards the other, especially in conflict areas and situations. You wrote in A Whole Life in 12 Movies, this new book that you wrote with Kathleen Norris about Wonder Woman 1984, which one of your movies you like to talk a lot about. And so what is a big superhero movie going to tell us how to actually work out a different story, a new story when it comes to conflict?
Yeah. Well, Wonder Woman 84 is a really intriguing one for me because lots of people don't like that film. But then again, lots of people like sports, and they're wrong too. So I'm not going to stop them liking sports, but I will make a case for Wonder Woman 84 being both a very good film and an extremely important one. And it's important even if it's not good, because the narrative in Wonder Woman does two things that very few superhero films do, very few kind of popular stories do. One of those things is something that almost none do. The two things that it does is it has an inner life for the hero that includes vulnerability. Superman does that. Clark Kent has kind of a sadness in him because he can't ever tell Lois Lane who he really is, and because he's lost two sets of parents or two sets of home, and because he aches for the world. And I think some of the more recent manifestations of superhero movies, at least one or two of the Spider-Man iterations, and even Batman, has played with the idea of what might it be like to know that you can save some but not all, and however you are aware of all the needs Who do you decide to help? And that's a very interesting thing that anybody who believes in a sense of vocation or a calling for your life is going to have to grapple with. I know a lot of clergy people. I know some therapists. Therapists often seem to have better boundaries than clergy, and part of that is because the therapist can say, you're coming for a 50-minute session, starts at this time, and you don't have my home phone number. Clergy, it's usually different. But what do you do that brings you alive and that serves the needs of the world, especially if you're hyper tuned into the needs of the world? That's one thing. So the Wonder Woman films really do address that, because Diana, the kind of, I guess, the Amazonian name for the character called Wonder Woman, she's not eternal, but she's very, very old, although she doesn't age. And so she gets to experience centuries of pain. I find that deeply moving, about the decisions she makes, about how to live with a sense of everybody she knows not only is going to die, but she's going to witness their death or be around when they die. The second thing, and the more important thing, is the way it treats its villain. This has almost never been done in mainstream popular storytelling, where the villain who, like a James Bond villain, wants to take over the world and has the means to do it, ends up being given a completely credible motivation for why he's behaving in this way. He's angry because he's afraid that the thing that he loves is going to be taken away from him. In fact, the thing that he loves was taken away from him. He was treated with indignity as a child. And so he overcompensated by saying, I'm never going to let anybody do that to me again. I'm going to be in charge. I'm going to bend them all to my will. So he gets a motivation that we can understand, and he cannot be defeated through physical force. And sometimes that's the case. He can only be defeated through an authoritative word from Wonder Woman, who, exhausted in the corner, simply speaks not to him, but to the whole world. She gets to broadcast to the whole world. And she tells the whole world, look, some of you can have what you want, but the only way for some of you to have everything you want is for most other people to have nothing that they want. The only way for all of us to have some of what we want is if none of us has everything that we want. And that it is better to want the truth, even if it causes some long or some short-term struggle, than to have a lie that makes you happy in the short term and at the expense of other people's suffering. The culmination of Wonder Woman 84 is literally the bad guy repents, as does the entire human race, everybody who has kind of hitched themselves to his vision of the world. The human race decides it'd be better to live with uncertainty and truth and the possibility of sharing than a small number of us getting everything that we want. And I find that, that is a revolutionarily moving way of telling a story. It is an astonishing thing that it showed up in a massive Hollywood movie, and it is not a surprise that it was not noticed as such. And that when you talk to most people about most people haven't seen it. It didn't do. It was released during the first year of COVID, so it didn't really have the chance to breathe. No pun intended. And when I've talked with people about it, about 1% will say what I just said. They'll say, "Wasn't it amazing? This incredible thing." And it's always been women. So it's always been cisgender women who've responded to it this way in the way they spoke to me. Most other people have said, "Oh, they didn't like that film, or they thought it was cheesy," which I think was misunderstanding. It's partly a satire of 1980s Reagan era Rambo type movies. It's meant to be cheesy. And then when you point out, but what about what the villain did? They're like, oh yeah, I didn't notice that. And it's not an indictment of them. It's an indictment or a critique of the culture that we live in which what Walter Wink called the myth of redemptive violence is so passively accepted as the way things should be. And you don't have to go as far as actually using literal, physical, lethal violence to embody the myth of redemptive violence. Really, the myth of redemptive violence is anytime you enshrine the idea that you can bring order out of chaos through force, and that it's my job to conquer other people, whether that's in real estate or in war, whether that's in how you serve on a nonprofit board, or in how how you do your podcast, I do mine. How are we in relation to other podcasts? Do we want to beat them all, or do we want everybody to get a piece of the pie? So that's what I think Wonder Woman 84 does. Yeah, every day I stare out my window for a good minute, feeling sad for all the people that haven't seen it yet. Patty Jenkins, who co-wrote and directed that film, truly deserves far more complex credit than she has received. And Gal Gadot as well, who plays that role, for playing like vulnerability and strength in the same body, which is who all of us are. That's a tremendous gift.
Yeah, it feels to me like there needs to be some more interdependence in storytelling, especially from a female perspective. If you're talking to people that 1% get what was going on in Wonder Woman in 1984, and most of them are all female, and it's a female perspective, and thinking that, okay, we now have a culture and a place where we're trying to say, do we want authoritarianism to bring us some peace and like settle our fear, or do we want a little bit more of ambiguity in the midst of uncertainty, where not everybody gets everything that they want, but we probably all have what we need. And it's a dichotomy of choice there. And so I think that's the power of story. It's the power of storytelling, to say, oh, there is a different way and a new way. It's the power of imagination. I'd love for you to go in just briefly your 7-story paradigm. And the 7th story is, I think, revolutionary to me because, one, it helps me view movies, literature, things through different stories is helpful. And 2, it helps me view different cultures in different ways, where I can say, oh, this is the story that they're telling. There has to be a new imagination, a new, better way. Take us through that framework, just in how do we actually then identify stories that cultures and movies and things are telling?
You call it my 7-story framework, and it's not. It's something I share very much with Brian McLaren, who actually introduced me to the idea. And Brian's so humble. He'd say he was just thinking about this one day and these ideas emerged. And I mean, and so he then shared them with me, and we wrote a couple of books about them together. And that's part of the point of the 7th story, is about sharing. Everybody gets to bring their part. And the idea is that there are, you could say that there are 6 basic stories that humans have evolved to try to bring peace and security, and none of them work. So the first story is the domination story. That's the story that says, I'll get peace and security by ruling over you. The second is the revolution story, which is, I'll get peace and security by overthrowing the dominators, and then I'll rule over them. Maybe in a slightly less bad way, but it's still conquest of a kind, or domination of a kind. The third is the isolation story, which is, I'll get peace and security by withdrawing and going out into the desert or the wilderness, and I'll build a utopian community in the promised land, and I'll get away from you. And the problem is those communities always devolve into domination and revolution stories, unless they get really, really healthy, which actually depends on being less isolated. And then there's the purification story, which is the one that says, I'll get peace and security by blaming you, by exiling you. You're the problem, which is not factual. It's not equal among every person, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn said the line between good and evil runs through the center of every one of us. And I did not mean the dead center, 50% one side, 50% good, 50% bad. But it's not their fault. They are not to blame. There is no them, actually. It's not the same thing as holding boundaries, especially regarding the potential for harm. But as another Brian Ammons, my partner in life and in a lot of work, says that everybody's invited to the table. I don't own the table. If religious language has life-giving meaning for you, it's God's table. And if religious language isn't life-giving for you, then you could say it's the table of goodness, the table of community, the table of well-being. We don't own that table. Everybody is invited to that table. There's only one rule, and the rule is that you have to commit to not harming anybody. And if you can't commit to that rule, then you can't sit at the table. You sit outside, and we'll send people out to check in on you from time to time to see when you're ready. We'll make you a plate, but you can't come in unless you commit to not consciously harming. The fifth story is the story of victimization. And that's the story that says my identity is my suffering, and my purpose is to blame and defeat you because of the suffering you caused. Not the same thing as binding the wounds of the brokenhearted, not the same as caring for people who've suffered. But we've all seen it, and we've seen it politicized when suffering gets used as a way of causing other suffering in the world. And the sixth story is the story of accumulation. That says I'll bring peace and security by having more stuff, whether it's a bigger sofa or a bigger house, or let's invade a country while we're at it, and we'll take that too. The things that these six stories have in common is that they're all separation stories, versions of us versus them. And the second thing they have in common is that they don't work. Anybody who fully gives themselves to these stories doesn't turn out to have peace and security. They might be behind a wall in a big mansion, but they're not happy. But as with many things, the solution is found within really taking a long, hard look at the story itself. And so the solution to the domination story is not no leadership. It's servant leadership rather than conquest leadership. And the solution to the revolution story is not no justice. It's transformative justice, in which even the former oppressors are invited to the table with the same rule: don't harm anybody, and maybe make some amends too. And the solution to the isolation story is not no peace and quiet. It's cultivate a contemplative space within your own being so that you can be present even in the noisiest space and still be at peace, and take a retreat from time to time. And, the answer to the purification story is not no judgment or no boundaries. It's restorative justice that includes holding the boundaries and intervening to prevent further harm and looking after the needs of those who've suffered, but also offering an opportunity for what might be called in rehabilitation or restoration for the people causing the suffering. The answer to victimization, again, is not ignore the needs of the victims. It's actually give victims and survivors what they most need, which is often material needs. Many people in the north of Ireland could not generate the same income that their spouse had generated before they were murdered, because it was often men who were murdered and women who were widowed, and it was a very patriarchal society. And I met at least one woman who had to work 3 jobs after her husband was murdered. That should never have happened. The society should have met her material needs, and then over time, with her emotional, psychological needs, they may never be totally resolvable, but then can I ask her, what do you want to do with your life? We help you repair whatever you can. And the response to the story of accumulation is not don't have things. It's move beyond a notion of possessiveness and hoarding toward a notion of stewardship and sharing. Actually make beautiful things, have beautiful things, but be willing to give them to someone who would find them more life-giving than you. And if you have 2 coats and someone has none, you might want to consider what a good use of the second coat would be. Not to beat us up, but because this is a more beautiful life. This is a more enjoyable life. And when people ask me, what do you want for the future? I generally just say more sharing of stuff, and more sharing of heart, and more sharing of ourselves with the rest of the ecosystem of which we are a part. And all those 6 better lenses could be summarized by the 7th story, which we call the story of liberation and reconciliation. It's reconciliation with all things, reconciliation with all pain, reconciliation with all hope, coming into alignment, not so that we're all the same, but that we can cheer each other on and help each other when we stumble, and say, hey, listen, I see that there's this thing you need that you don't have, and I've got more of it than you do, so I'm going to offer you this part. And by the way, you've got this thing that I don't have. Could you offer me some of that too? And this is a lens I use when I'm looking at stories that other people are telling. And, hopefully I use it to look at my own stories when I'm in danger of believing my own propaganda.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Wouldn't that make a great fantasy epic novel? Just having those having 7 kingdoms and what.
Yeah, I've thought of the idea of a character who, I didn't come up with this idea, but it's occurred to me. I'm sure with a lot of others, you could have a character who goes through 7 portals, and they have this same they have the same sort of narrative happen to them, reflected through each of the 6 stories each time, and then something happens that enables them to bring a 7th story lens, where they see somebody bringing a 7th story lens to it. And I think you would got to show in our storytelling the joy of experimenting with the 7th story. It's another thing about Wonder Woman is, like at the end of that film, she doesn't have everything she wants, but she is actually at peace, and she's able to. It's gratifying to her to see other people be well because of what she's brought to them, and that may be something to do with the stages of life. There's a stage of life where you want stuff for yourself, you want success for yourself, and then maybe there comes it. Hopefully, healthy growth starts to expand the circle beyond your own ego to what can I do for others, and how do I want to see other people thrive.
A couple of quick little questions I'd like to ask at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Jeepers. Good Lord. If I'm being realistic, I would want a voice in his head to say, you're just as good as everybody else. You're just as good as everybody else. You're not as broken as you think you are. You're not as messed up as you think you are. There's nothing wrong with you. Or there's nothing wrong with you that isn't wrong with the average person, because that's not the same thing as saying you're perfect. But, you're just as lovable as everybody else. And that's kind of being realistic about a voice in the head. Being more unrealistic would be seek out the wisest mentors that you can find. It was a bit later than that before I really started to find those kind of mentors. But I've often thought if I had particularly an open-minded mentor who wasn't homophobic and was able to fuse an affirmation of who I was with an affirmation of spirituality and authentic religious practice, that didn't come for a lot longer, but I also don't really regret it, because the same thing with everybody. All the goodness in my life today also proceeds from choices and chance happenings and serendipitous things that happened when I was 21. And what was the other question?
The other question, anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Well, I did forget to say I would also advise my 21-year-old self that in 28 years from now, you're going to write a really interesting book with Kathleen Norris called A Whole Life in 12 Movies, which will not bring peace to the world, but it won't hurt. It won't prevent peace coming to the world. And the more of you that buy it, you never know what might happen. And what I'm reading and watching, well, two things. I'm reading an extraordinary novel called Son House by David James Duncan. It's the longest novel I've ever read, 776 pages, and it is a dream of a book, really about the kind of consciousness and community that a lot of us feel drawn to, of interdependence, creativity, stewardship, and sharing. And it is a thrilling novel. I think actually it's been marketed as an epic comedy, and I think that doesn't do it justice. It is funny, but it's a very deep, dramatic book. And the recent film that I would most eagerly recommend to people is a film by Wim Wenders called Perfect Days, which is set in Tokyo about a man who cleans toilets for a living and is a mystic, and like it's a week in his life, and this film will reduce your blood pressure if you need your blood pressure reduced. It's really a utopian vision of a completely achievable utopia.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful film. Love it. I would highly recommend it as well. Gareth, how could people go out and get your book, A Whole Life in 12 Movies? How could people connect with you?
All right. Well, there's 2 ways to get my book. One is you can start walking now to my house. And when you get here, depending on how long you've come, I will get a couple of medieval monks to officially transcribe it in calligraphy on parchment paper. Or the other way to get it is
if you promise, I'll do it.
You could just order it online or from your local bookshop. That's the other way to do it. Comes out on the 15th of October. A Whole Life in 12 Movies is what it's called, by myself and Kathleen Norris. So there's a couple of in-person things that people are very welcome to. One is a little event that we call the Porch Gathering that happens just outside Asheville, North Carolina in the middle of March. And if you go to The Porch Gathering, or if you prefer, theporchgathering.com, the details are there. And that's a sort of a mini festival conference dedicated to the experience of transformative storytelling. And you can come as a listener, you can come as someone who wants to be part of a community of like-minded people, and you don't have to be a formal storyteller to enjoy it. My view is that every human being is a storyteller, and coming to this kind of stuff helps calibrate that. And the second thing is we're privileged to host what we call retreats in Ireland that are sort of deep dive educational, spiritual immersion experiences in the north of Ireland that includes some time with the natural landscape and some time with the culture, some time with the music, and with people who were directly involved in peace building as a way of inspiring ourselves for the journey wherever we may be, in terms of what it might mean to live a transformative story that starts with caring for ourselves, but very, very quickly includes caring for the people we come into contact with and the ecosystem that has brought us to life. And you can find out about those at irelandretreats.com. We've got 5 of those on the calendar for next year, and they're small groups, and we've been doing them for about a decade. About 400 people have come, and lots of people seem to have a really beautiful experience, and we have a beautiful experience doing it. And you can find me and read more of what I'm writing at theporchcommunity.net, which also links to our Substack, which is theporch.substack.com.
Sounds good. Well, Gareth, thank you for this conversation. It was fantastic talking through peacemaking, conflict, fear, love of self, love of others, and movies and bigger imagination and a different story, and figuring out the stories that we tell are not the stories that we should be living into. We could live it into a new and better and greater story if we just learn how to tell a better story. So, Gareth, thank you for this. It was fantastic. I loved it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Joshua. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.